Professor Manu Mangattu has also joined us. Welcome, welcome, sir.
And Professor Mehra is also joining.
Pardon?
Professor Parmod has joined. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Sarika, has Inayat joined? Subhash?
Ma'am, I can't see them, but I can inform.
Yeah, just drop a message.
Yes, ma'am.
So around 275 participants have joined us.
Some are still joining.
Geeta, क्या कह रहे थे आप?
Ma'am,
You were saying something?
some are still joining.
Yeah, yeah. Geeta, am I audible? आवाज धीरे तो नहीं है मेरी?
नहीं मैम.
No, ma'am, it's good.
It's
Good morning, Manu sir.
Hi, good morning, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. Thank you.
Good morning, sir.
welcome, Professor Manu.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we are
Principal sir has joined.
Join कर लिया sir ने? Yes. Welcome, sir. Principal sir, good morning.
Good morning, madam. Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning.
Okay.
Good morning, Vineet.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Ji. Good morning.
So, sir, आपके आते ही around 300 participants, more than 300 participants are there in the webinar.
अच्छा, मेरे आने से होने थे तो मैं 5 मिनट पहले आ जाता. These all are your efforts and the attraction of your speakers.
Yeah. So, it's 10, sir. Should we start?
हाँ, मेरे ख्याल से ऑनलाइन का ये तो है ही, टाइम से शुरू होना ही चाहिए.
जी. Because हमारा एक next webinar भी line up है, so we will have to take care of the time.
Yeah. अभी मैडम मुझे लगता है तेजी से संख्या बढ़ रही है.
जी, 324.
हाँ,
Should
तो
we wait for 5 minutes?
हाँ, 2-4 मिनट और इंतजार कर लें, क्योंकि कोई भी इससे रह ना जाए ना.
ठीक है.
आपके डिपार्टमेंट के लोग आ गए हैं क्या?
Sarika has joined. Geeta is there. Sarika, how about Inayat and Subhash, Vijay?
I'm joined.
They have
They have
joined.
joined.
So we
सभी को
have
नमस्कार.
speakers.
अंग्रेजी विभाग के सभी सदस्यों को नमस्कार.
Namaskar, sir.
सर हमारे स्पीकर्स ने भी ज्वाइन कर लिया है.
तो शुरू कीजिए मैडम फिर. हाँ, we can't keep them waiting.
ठीक है
Yes.
सर. respected Principal Dr. Krishna Khan, Professor Dr. Pramod Kumar Mehra, Professor Manu, worthy teachers from colleges and universities who have joined from across the country, my colleagues and dear students. A good morning, a very good morning to all of you. Before the start of the webinar, we wish to seek the blessings of Ma Saraswati, our goddess of wisdom and learning, with a Saraswati Mandana. Vineet, please.
विनीत साउंड नहीं है.
साउंड नहीं है.
चलने दीजिए. लेट इट कंटिन्यू. कमल मैडम कंटिन्यू कीजिए. अनम्यूट कीजिए अपने आप को. अनम्यूट कीजिए.
Let Ma Saraswati bless us, illuminate us, guide us through this difficult time. As we are meeting online, we like to welcome our guest with virtual bouquets. Vineet, please help us with that. On behalf of the Department of English and my own behalf, we welcome Principal Dr. Krishna Khan, Professor Pramod Kumar Mehra, and Professor Manu Mangattu. Sir, I once again welcome you all on my behalf and on behalf of the Department of English. On behalf of the Department of English of Aggarwal College and on my own behalf, I welcome you all once again. It's an honor for the Department of English that we are organizing a national webinar on world literature, transcending boundaries and connecting cultures. World literature has received a remarkable momentum since 19th century. Different views expressed by intellectuals and scholars have broadened its dimension. It refers to the literary works that move beyond linguistically and politically drawn cultural borders, where translation has played a major role. It's a proud privilege for us that today we have two prominent scholars with us who will share their insights. I welcome Professor Dr. Pramod Kumar Mehra, a professor of English in School of Humanities, Indira Gandhi National Open University, New Delhi. He has authored several books and research articles in journals of international repute. He is a proud recipient of Australia-India Council Fellowship. He has been awarded as Ambassador for Peace by the Universal Peace of Federation for his contribution to international peace. Sir, we are honored to have you amongst us. We express our gratitude for accepting our invitation. I welcome Professor Manu, who is a poet, editor, teacher, film critic, research consultant, and publishing expert. He has done lots of translation work and was hailed as Comrade to Poetry China for his great contribution in taking Chinese poetry to Western world. He was honored with the prestigious Most Read and Recommended Research Award for the last 3 years. I welcome you, sir, and express our gratitude for being with us. Now, I take it as a privilege to welcome our principal, Dr. Krishna Khan. He is a renowned physicist and has more than 300 publications to his credit. He is a member of several national and international bodies and the proud recipient of Best Principal Award by the Honorable Governor of Haryana. He is an able administrator. It is because of his dynamic and visionary leadership that our college has been awarded A++ grade by NAC in 2019. Sir, we heartily welcome you to this webinar and thank you for your continuous support and motivation. I welcome all the participants and sincerely thank the worthy teachers from various colleges who have enthusiastically contributed to this webinar. Last but not the least, we thank Mr. Vaneet Nagpal for providing us with technical support. I once again welcome you all and express our gratitude to you. May God bless us all. Now I invite and request Principal Sir for his formal address.
Thank you, Madam Kamal Tandon. Good morning to all who are on board with us in this national webinar, Transcending Boundaries and Connecting Cultures. At the outset, I also welcome our esteemed speakers, Professor Pramod Kumar Mehra ji, Department of English, Indira Gandhi National Open University, New Delhi, a poet and an author and research consultant, Professor Manu Mangattu ji, who are there with us and who will be talking about this very relevant topic, transcending boundaries and connecting cultures. You will be talking about various poets, about various thinkers who had written on this topic, but I will be talking in a different way. Because we started this program with the prayer of Goddess of Knowledge, Ma Saraswati. So when we talk of God, it has 5 elements. हिंदी में हम भगवान कहते हैं उसको, और भगवान में भूमि, गगन, वायु, अग्नि और नीर, these are 5 elements. तो क्या कभी आपने सोचा है कि पृथ्वी को, पक्षी को, पानी को, प्रकाश को, पावक को, पवन को, अंतरिक्ष को, आकाश को, क्या कभी इनको सीमाओं को लागने की जरूरत पड़ती है क्या? मैं ये व्यक्तिगत रूप से मानता हूं कि संस्कृति का उद्भव और विकास के ये सभी एलिमेंट साक्षी हैं। तो जब इनको लांघने की जरूरत नहीं पड़ती, तो ये बाउंड्री वर्ड आया कहां से? फ्रॉम वेयर दिस वर्ड बाउंड्री केम? वी ह्यूमंस, we created boundaries on the surface of earth by using mortars and bricks. Even in water, in oceans, we created boundaries. Even in sky, we created boundaries. So I personally feel that this boundary is our own creation. And whenever we talk of the boundaries and cultures, there can be 2 perspectives. One is the regional and national perspective, and another is the global perspective. And boundaries also can be of 2 types. One which I discussed, that physical boundaries, which are developed by bricks and mortars. And there is another boundary which is very important and which we need to talk, mental boundary, which is developed by our thought process. But mind one thing, my dear friends, cross boundaries, transcend boundaries, but don't leave your modesty and dignity. Whenever a person leaves the modesty and dignity, it creates devastation. History is in front of us. Rama crossed boundaries. From India, he went to Sri Lanka. लेकिन उन्होंने कभी मर्यादा को नहीं छोड़ा. Because he did not leave dignity and modesty, he became a great man. On the other hand, Ravana, he also crossed boundaries. From Sri Lanka, he came to India. माता सीता का हरण करके ले गया. इतना विद्वान आदमी, शिव तांडव स्त्रोत का रचयिता, लंका का राजा रावण, पर क्योंकि उसने मर्यादा को छोड़ दिया, इसलिए आज भी लोग दशहरा के दिन उसका संस्कार करते हैं, उसको जलाते हैं। तो whenever we talk about transcending the boundaries and we try to connect the cultures, we should not leave our modesty and dignity. And this connecting the boundaries, transcending the boundaries and connecting the culture, it is a very broad perspective. At times in different situations, the meanings are also different. I think all these topics will be discussed in this national webinar, in which the organizing secretaries are Dr. Inayat Chaudhary and Mr. Subhash. The co-convener is Dr. Geeta Gupta and Dr. Sarika Kanjlia. And convener is, of course, our head of the department and senior most professor in the institution, Madam Kamal Tandon. They have done great efforts in roping in such great speakers in this very important webinar. और मैं एक चीज का जिक्र ना करूं, ट्रांसेंडिंग द बाउंड्रीज और कनेक्टिंग कल्चर्स की बात हो तो शायद वो मेरे पार्ट पे बेईमानी होगी। भारतीय इतिहास की सबसे बड़ी घटना जिसमें सीमाओं को लांघा गया और संस्कृति का जुड़ाव हुआ, 1893 स्वामी विवेकानंद एट शिकागो सर्वधर्म सम्मेलन। वो भारतीय संस्कृति को लेकर के वहां पर गए, उन्होंने भारतीय संस्कृति से लोगों को रूबरू कराया। और मुझे याद है कि एक अंग्रेज ने जब उनकी वेशभूषा को देख करके उनसे कहा कि ये क्या आप धोती कुर्ता पहनते हैं, यू डू नॉट लुक लाइक ए जेंटलमैन। तो ही रिप्लाइड, इन योर प्लेस इट इज द ड्रेस विच मेक्स यू जेंटलमैन, एंड एट आवर प्लेस इट इज द कैरेक्टर हु मेक्स अस जेंटलमैन। So that you have to decide, because we want to exchange of culture. What type of culture? Is it the physical culture? I think no. It should be culture of heart. It should be culture of mind. It should be culture of soul. It should be spiritual cultural exchange, moral cultural exchange, emotional cultural exchange, and technological cultural exchange. And whenever we talk of technological cultural exchange, it should be for the benefit of mankind. Corona, COVID-19, you can say technology, but China making devastation in the entire world. So that also we have to see, because whenever you will cross the boundaries, you will find different type of culture. There may be culture of dress, there may be culture of address, there may be culture of thoughts that you have to see. और ये आपको डिसाइड करना है कि आपने किस देश की संस्कृति से क्या लेना है और अपनी देश में जो संस्कृति है वो अच्छी बातों को कैसे उनको देना है। तो ट्रांसेंडिंग द बाउंड्रीज और कनेक्टिंग कल्चर्स की बात हो और वसुधैव कुटुंबकम, होल वर्ल्ड इज वन, ये बात ना कही जाए तो हम सबको we should have a feeling of oneness. Only then we can talk of connecting the cultures. मैं एक संस्कृत के श्लोक के साथ, क्योंकि आजकल ये महामारी फैली हुई है और सब बहुत तनाव में हैं, लेकिन इस तरह के वेबिनार्स जब हम लोग ऑर्गेनाइज करते हैं तो डेफिनेटली इट ऑल्सो कनेक्ट द कल्चर्स एंड क्रिएट्स ए डिफरेंट एनवायरमेंट। तो एक श्लोक के साथ मैं अपनी बात को विराम दूंगा। सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिना, सर्वे सन्तु निरामया, सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु मां कश्चित् दुर्भाग् भवेत्। मैडम कमल, आपने मुझे मौका दिया ऐसे महान वक्ताओं के साथ अपनी बात साझा करने के लिए, और बहुत सारे लोग, जैसा कि मैं देख रहा था कि ये तो कमाल ही कर रखा आपने, 428 learned teachers from various universities and colleges pan India, they have already joined this webinar. So I think it is the persuasion of Department of English in Aggarwal PG College, Ballabgarh, and the attraction of these two great speakers that teachers in such a large number have joined this webinar. I congratulate you all and I wish you all a great success. Thank you.
Very well said, sir. We need to bridge our differences, but we should at the same time take care of our self-respect and dignity. And I think literature binds us all. Thank you so much, sir, for your pearls of wisdom. Sir has always motivated and inspired us in whatever field we try to venture. Thank you for being here, sir. Thank you so much. Now I take the privilege to introduce our first resource person, Professor Dr. Parmod Kumar Mehra, Department of English, IGNOU, New Delhi. Professor Parmod is an Australian Studies Scholar and has received prestigious Australia-India Council Fellowship. He has also acted as a cultural ambassador of India and delivered lectures on incredible cultural diversity of India. He has 6 books and innumerable research papers to his credit. He has also organized a number of international and national seminars to promote the interest of larger humanity. He has also represented India at various international forums and promoted the cause of equality, peace, and global citizenship. He has been honored as the Ambassador for Peace by the Universal Peace Foundation. Sir, we are also honored to have you on board today. Sir will deliver a talk on world literature, transcending boundaries. Over to you, Pramod, sir, and welcome you once again.
Very much. I hope all of you can hear me.
Yes, sir.
We can hear you.
All
we can
right.
hear.
So I'm indeed very delighted to be able to connect to all of you for this discussion. May I begin with a sincere note of thankfulness for the organizers for this opportunity, particularly Dr. Geeta Gupta. The way he started, he has made art us very easier, and I must admire and appreciate his sense of scholarship and then the kind of seamless knowledge that he seems to have. I have heard a great deal of praise about your college and the English faculty and the kind of efforts that you are putting in for making lives more enabling for your students. So I'm really grateful, thankful, and I wish you all the success in your efforts to create a better learning environment for the students. And I can see that many faculty members have also joined in from various parts of our country. So I express my gratitude towards them also for the presence. Today's interaction, I thought that we'll discuss how literature in general and the notion of world literature in particular allows us to transcend boundaries, and then helps us to navigate to reach different and unique standpoints where we all aspire to reach. I hope you, as teachers and students of literature, you understand how it is very difficult. If we look at 1950 onwards, we find that there was more of kind of thrust towards national literatures, where we look at literatures in their nationalistic concerns. So I thought that let's today, like for example, it's not new like what I'm going to talk about, but I thought that let's underline some of the aspects so that we can bring home some important insights as to what we understand about literature, about world literature, and we can seek a way forward as far as the future is concerned and the kind of times where we are caught in. And so, increasing attention to the enduring process of cosmopolitanism, globalization, and transnationalism, together with growing adjustment with the geographic, linguistic, and conceptual limitations to many of our literature, has led to the past 2 decades to burgeoning interest in the discipline of world literature. You will find that institutes are being built up, conferences, articles, volumes, and journals on various aspects of world literatures are proliferating around the world as never before. I fundamentally feel that it is maybe in its role as a concept, it is new, it is novel, but otherwise the sensitivity, the sensibility is not. The new media technologies explode, so do new ways of disseminating books across national boundaries, And as new ways emerge of delivering world literature to readers outside, many scholars are examining the implications of translations on literature, the impact that literature has on culture, and the ways that cultures can transform books. I think the world literature can be an amazing tool for analyzing globalization because it provides a wonderful opportunity and example on the ways that information is shared across languages and culture. My dear participants, if I may take briefly like to discuss the kind of foundational aspect. The term world literature itself derives from Goethe's neologism world literature and recorded by personal secretary Johann Peter Ackerman from a conversation over a dinner and one night. So I would request you to just look at it as a kind of story unfolding, as a kind of minor tale, which is being taking place where these two people, Goethe and then his secretary, who was again a very big authority, literary authority. So they are, and the way Goethe announces, what does he say? He says that national literature is now rather an unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach. Just like our principal was saying, there are no boundaries, there is no sense of isolation or alienation. I mean, we are meant to merge and kind of collaborate and then, synergize in a big way. So Goethe pronounces that in a very important way. And the newness of this term is evidenced in John Oxenford's 1930 translation by the hyphenation that brings the compound concept over from the German to English. Like there are always people saying that when we call Goethe as the kind of father figure of world literature, so I think, but he kind of reveals the sensitivity, he brings out the concept, but he didn't elaborate it on in a big way. But there are other people who have done that. We'll discuss that. So what we are trying to understand that world literature, which is now a commonplace in English, although that is that what exactly it is, it remains a matter of debate, allowing for such titles as David Damrosch, who talks about it in a book in a big way, 2003. The book was What is World Literature? But what, if we look at in the context of what Goethe meant by world literature, or what we mean today, for example, by world literature is not big of concern. In Ackerman's account, the conversation in which Goethe lets slip the word which will create a new field of study begins thus. What does he say? I will quote from the conversation. Within the last few days since I saw you, I have read many things, especially a Chinese novel, which occupies me still and seems to me very remarkable. Chinese novel, said I, that must look strange enough, not so much as you might think, said Goethe. The Chinamen think, act, and feel almost exactly like us. What comes out is that world literature was grounded in translation practice, in creating a canon representing the best of each nation. Translation occupied building in Europe in the 19th century was combined with the idea of transnational literature, where translation was an important tool of transmission and exchange as a way of decentering from a strong monolingual base. I think at this point, when we are discussing the foundational aspect, it is important to note that long list of intellectuals and scholars from almost every corner of the world, starting from Goethe to Damrosch in the present, Casanova to Gayatri Spivak and Milan Kundera, have not only projected their respective views to define this new discipline, but also broadened the dimensions of this inviting discipline. I think I would like to refer, and it will be meaningful to kind of connect to R.K. Das Gupta's threefold definition that he gave in 1967. This is important. He has taken into account all major contours of the discipline and the concept. First, world literature, he says, that can be summed up, can be defined as the sum total of all the literatures of the world. A wide definition that we hear every now and then. So whatever is being written, whatever is being circulated, produced, distributed is in that sense world literature. That is one definition. And the next part, in the next sense of, in his effort to define it, or you can call it a new next definition, he refers to world literature as works in different literatures of the world which have attained world recognition. Very important, world recognition. His second definition takes us to a highly popular work, which gained popular attention through the sense of addressing a core issue concerning larger humanity, and a work which can be classified as a best-selling literature. Friends, you will understand that our world is kind of riddled with barriers of caste, class, gender, and race. Suppose if a text addresses and relates to one of these aspects, or maybe all of these aspects put together in a very unique way, in a very important way, so that strikes the audience's attention. So that can also be called world literature. And in his formulation of the third sense of categorization, R.K. Gupta talks about it. World literature can be understood as different literatures of the world conceived as one literature. And this is now the predominant meaning of the term that we understand today. I'm trying to kind of contend that Getty's concept of a literature was based on the practice of translation in the creation of a canon that would represent the best of each nation in both its specificity and its universality. Translation played a crucial role. Far from being a doctrine, Getty's concept is a structural sketch which originated in a moment when Getty became aware of this reputation abroad and began to read his own writings in translation. The term also emerged during a time of profound change in German culture between 1780 to 1820. If you look at it chronologically, when there was much debate about translating as a way of mediating between the domestic and the foreign, a period since seen as a paradigmatic for European literature. Johann Ackermann that we talked about, the discussion between the person and his secretary, reported that Getty referred to the epoch of world literature in January 1827. So when we are saying that it's not a new concept, and it has, so it can be traced back as far as the literary consumption is concerned. That is not long after the Napoleonic Wars, which divided Europe in an era when the Revolutionary Wars, Napoleon's campaigns and wars of liberation had just ravaged Europe. The epoch of world literature is meant to heal rifts and to unite culturally and what politically is thoroughly divided. The aim is mutual toleration. So what our theme of our today's discussion is how literature and world literature has to come in a way, more visibly in its ability, capacity to connect cultures, to transcend boundaries. It is important. Yes, so like Getty, when he was talking about it, and the way we talked about that our country's tradition, our civilizational motto is also like Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and whatever our literature says is not only for a geographical entity, not only for limited geographical space, but for the entire universe. I think when we are discussing world literature, it is relevant that we take into account the various theories associated with this discipline, this a new idea that we are beginning to now. I must share it with you that different universities are beginning to teach this this idea even in the undergraduate level of studies there, and in postgraduate studies there are elective level options, and people are doing their PhDs, MPhils on this discipline. So, what is the theoretical framework? How do we look at the conceptual dimensions of world literature? That is important. So, Goethe and Tagore, for example, if we look at the two important figures, they envisioned the possible expansion of world literature when the concept of world literature had not flourished at all. I mean, you may have more figures, but in terms of people who kind of elaborated on the spirit, the sensitivity and sensibility of it, you can look at these two people, Goethe from Germany and Tagore from our own Eastern tradition. Goethe viewed the national literature does not have any, kind of significance. And he said that it indicated the changing situation, advent of literature, and does not indicate the culmination of national literature. Rather, it is referred to the meaninglessness of the restricting literature within the national boundary. Goethe probably had foreseen that the author's recognition in his nation would not matter anymore, as the reception of the whole world through the literary exchange and translation would definitely earn him and his work the deserving position in world literature. He also predicted about the global circulation and the reception of the literature, that the works that appeal to the masses would enjoy limitless expansion. And he didn't speak about the evaluation criteria. In this context, another pioneer of world literature, for example, Tagore, considered time as the best judge. So when we are saying that a person writing in a kind of given geographical context, so he may not have the entire world in his purview, but you can say that the ability to communicate and the literature's power, strength to relate to the problems at large is very important. So the literature that does not resist the test of time would wither automatically, was his view. He advocated world literature not as kind of Vishwa Sahitya, but literature is not the mere total of works composed of different hands. He conceptualized world literature as a master kind of architecture without a planned structure. The master builders, for example, what we call authors, contribute to the continuous process of this mansion, this building, this premise, this grand architecture through their work, where time plays the role of a testifier. After Goethe, it was Engels and Karl Marx who gave a stunning remark about the bourgeois domination over the world market. Referring to literature, they stated, the national one-sidedness and the narrow-mindedness became increasingly impossible. And from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a kind of new entity that may be called world literature. The emergence of the world market is the byproduct of European colonialism, which complicates the idea of world literature and implicitly indicating the extension of colonialism. If we go a little forward, we find that the Communist Manifesto aspired to be a model of world literature also. And in this process got translated into 6 languages, for example, like English, French, Germany, Italian, Dutch, and then Flemish. So the concept of a literary framework was also emphasized by many other people, including Fritsch, in his attempt to define this. He says, when it is important to look at these important definitions, when we are exploring the theoretical framework, that world literature is a network having fundamental economic character, serving to promote a traffic in ideas between people. literary market to which nation brings their intellectual treasures for exchange. One of the theorists of world literature perceived world literature as unattainable ideal. So what is unattainable ideal is a kind of constant churning taking place, constant sense of negotiation taking place. So when when we talk about the possibility of world literature through translation, it is again a dialogue, a seamless sense of conversation, which is not static, which is very dynamic, taking place and leading to meaning, higher meaning or multiple meanings. That is important. So when we are talking about the conceptual framework, how people question the misunderstanding of the concept of world literature by the world and condemn the childlike demand of the nations for their own world literature. The people like Frisch, asserted that the conception of every nation to insist of monoglottism and the desire to prove the supremacy of their language would ultimately end up with futile attempts. He insisted upon the adherence of two principles, translation and polyglottism. His journal, the first journal of comparative literature, considered 10 working languages such as German, Spanish, French, English, Italian, Dutch, Swedish, Hungarian, and Icelandic. So, I mean, he was propounding that, and he believed that the comparison is possible only in the availability of the object in the original form. So, when we kind of take it forward, we find that the non-Western languages didn't receive a place in his principle of polyglottism, to which he stated is possibility is only when Asian literature will finally accept our alphabet. So you find that there is a sense of clash and conflict there, and the mutual acceptance and tolerance for each other can only enrich world literature. Was the opinion of Goethe. We find one section of world remain alienated and struggle to cope with the European language in the race of acquiring world literary space. How can the concept of world literature be justified until there is a unification of literature from across the world, irrespective of language and literature? My dear participants, what we are trying to kind of probe and kind of seek to explore that how to make this so-called concept of world literature purely pluralistic, purely in its we have to take it out from the kind of clutches of Eurocentrism and simply make it more democratic, more universalistic. So what like the Chinese scholar, for example, Cheng, also emphasized the need for this global unity of literature in spite of the differences between literature and rising from the locality and nationality time period and style to make it, in truly, kind of acceptable form. The partial attainment of the world literature is reflected in the works of Casanova, where she pointed out that the literary pieces get access to international reception through a wide network controlled by Western Europe, and she emphasized that the need to modify the instruments to measure and analyze and understand and compare text. World literature is not the sum total of the world's literary production. Rather, a world system, very important, a world system within which literature is produced and circulated. Well, a scientific approach of world literature was developed by Moretti, the Stanford world literature expert. Moretti, perceived this concept as a unified but unequal system, which contradicts the equal world literature that Goethe wished for and Marx professed, like Marx forecasted. He further considered world literature to be a problem that demands a new critical method. Very important. What that critical method will be, we'll discuss. A new hypothesis where a scientific approach of study through distant reading can serve as a tool to survey the world literary systems. I think this Moretti's argument is very important here. And the way he argues that the concept of world literature may not be the same for all the scholars. Every scholar has a unique perspective towards world literature as you know, as it is viewed. If you want me to define literature, I may say that it is the sum total of texts available to me at this moment, translation included. It's not very wise to say that world literature would be the one for everybody. So let's now say understand that the scholars attempted not only to define world literature but also to analyze the process of circulation and reception in the world. Later, this term received a clear kind of picture in the works of one of the leading proponents of world literature, David Damrosch. You will be able to identify with this name. He holds a summer school every year, and now he's he has given kind of thrust a very big push to this idea. And I would like to discuss one of his books where he has attempted to give clarity to the concept of world literature. What does he say? He says, all literary work that circulate beyond their culture of origin, either in translation or in the original language. This is very important. All literary work that is circulated beyond their culture of origin, either in translation or original language. So a recognition of the translated text and the linguistic power also. In this respect, I think we see the Nobel Prize winning literary pieces that receive popular circulation. I think he believed that world literature is still not completely global, and most of us also feel like that because of the power-centric structures in our world today, and the hegemonies of languages across. So it has remained confined to a specific small canon. It has, it raises the question that how can a world literature talk about the world when it includes only the Western production of literary text? When we have, like in the Eastern tradition, when we look at any major anthology of world literature, we find that just a very small marginal space is assigned to a text of Eastern literature. And how the word in the term world literature has lost its significance by Martin Buchner, where he considered the cosmopolitan center as a magnet that attracts everything, and the word in the processing in the process of moving towards it gets filtered through the hegemonic culture. This is much of a problem. The word cannot remain confined to a region or a continent as a dominant force by evaluating the truth to give them entry into the world forum. I think at this point it is relevant to take note that this creation of nation states in Europe in the 19th century coincided with the emergence of this idea of transnational literature, where translation was an important tool of transmission and exchange. As language teachers, we often engage ourselves in translation, and you will understand the dynamics, and then we can relate to this little complex notion of converting or transferring the meaning of one particular word and a text to a different language. Translation was widely considered as an effective medium towards enhancing dialogue and understanding between nations, that cultural mediation could compensate for the arrogance, intolerance, and ethnocentrism of the nation state. I think, like for instance, if you look at it, Thomas Carlyle in his 1827 essay on the state of German literature remarks that it has the best as well as the most translations because the Germans study foreign nations in a spirit which deserves to be often imitated. It is their honest endeavor to understand each with their own particularities in their own special manners of existing, not that they were praising it or kind of ridiculing it, or they were trying to attempt to alter it, but simply that they may see its manner of existing as the nation itself sees it. And so participate in whatever worth or beauty that it has brought into being. I think, when framework before us, it is, I hope that, I have managed to kind of talk about the conceptual, theoretical foundations. And I think like, simultaneously we can talk about the challenges, the issues, kind of complexities in dealing with world literature. Like, I hope you will agree with me, you'll understand this, that every nation attempts to visualize and comprehend world literature in their own way, complicating the issue, raising the question of their space in the world form. And like, what literature from India would enter the tradition of world literature? I mean, this question would automatically come up. And when we are discussing this, this may be kind of, coming up in your mind also. So the question that demands attention is, how does India perceive world literature? What criteria do the Indian literary texts follow to enter the world forum? Demirosh answered to this puzzle in his work that every literature work enters the world literature by traveling abroad through translation. He further stated that as criteria to enter the world forum, the literary works can either be classic, masterpiece, or window to the world. The selection of this kind of the text for the anthology is made on that basis. So I think that this is like, important, and this process gets a little more complicated when it remains under the subjugation of one language. It is important to kind of, as we were mentioning, that the hegemony tendencies of languages and their dominance implicitly indicating the cultural and literary colonialism. In the present era of globalization, my dear friends, English has the dominant position as a medium of literary exchange across the world, and the hegemony of language could also be seen in the preference of the language by the Nobel laureates. We may see that, like, Demirosh in his kind of what is world literature, then the seminal text that you may also refer to mention that one of the criteria for the literary work to enter, is that like, that circulation beyond its linguistic and cultural point of origin. For example, like, when we read some of the texts, most of the Russian texts, for example, we have studied those in the English medium, and we normally does not kind of discriminate and kind of distinguish as to what language that it comes from. So the translation then, serves as a bridge between the source language and the target language. And like, in addition, literature gets translated from English to another language, which in one way or the other expands in the horizons of English literature. But translation from another language into English is the rarest of rare. That is important. That is, kind of problem that you may kind of, note down and kind of address in the due course. The politics of English translations are pointed out by Lawrence Venuti, where he spoke about the domination of major literature over the minor. Kind of the way in the theoretical framework we talk about the grand tradition and the small tradition. So like, here also, like, it gets evident from the instance when the USA rejected to translate an Argentine George Borges fiction till French translations appeared in 1950 by a distinguished press. So is it not an alarming situation where the hegemony of few major languages makes it critical for the other languages to make their space in this, upcoming territory of world literature? We need to observe that authors sometimes adapt to the Western ideologies and follow the norms of the West with an expectation to get international recognition. I think, Spivak, who came out as a kind of critic, about this, kind of this tradition, this discipline. And she said that, this practice of world literature, is little, skewed and, needs to be kind of checked. And she was arguing that literature and the study of world literature ignores the power of work in its own language. Very important. Goethe who advocated to know and cherish each poet in his own language, in her own language, and within that specific area of time. And translator also in one of his interviews, like Spivak spoke about the important criteria for considering a literary work as world literature. First, the literary text must have traveled beyond the boundaries of nations, countries, and languages, and must have gone through translations. For example, like, when we talk about Arabian Nights, 1001 Nights can be the best example, which has been translated into many languages. So the world literature experts, the way we are talking about, like Damrush, Kushner, Ning, are involved in anthologizing the world literature masterpieces or kind of, components of world literature, so that a long marginalized literature across the world could be given their deserving positions. This Damrosch at one point of time stated that, that they have attempted to overcome the Eurocentric perspectives while choosing the text from the literature across the world for the anthology of the world literature. So I'm saying that the horizon has been extended from the Indian epics to the tale of Genji, the epic of Gilgamesh and Don Quixote. Every nation demands its own recognition, and in the world of literary market, resulting into the occasional clash between the regional, national, and the world literature. I'm saying that despite these complexities and the hegemonies and the clashes and the conflicts, we are gradually trying to make way, and that day is not far when we will have more and more Indian or kind of Eastern and kind of truly kind of global world character in the body of world literature. So when we are saying that, how to sum it up, like English language is at the center of the production and center of world literary market that attracts all literary works that surrender to its monopoly to let into the world forum. This cultural and linguistic hegemony of English is sometimes is referred to linguistic imperialism by so many people, like particularly Pennycook and Robert Phillipson. They have gone on to extend in a way they in their tendency to criticize, and they say English language for replacing and displacing other language. We will understand that we are talking about the language death concept in a big way. How we have lost many of the important languages that we had right throughout the 19th century, and how almost every year and every every week on every day basis we are kind of loosening, weakening our linguistic strength. That is something. So there seems to be a necessity of securing the linguistic and cultural pluralism to maintain the essence of world literature. Very important. This is the most important way, as when we are talking about bridging, creating bridges between cultures, connecting them and transcending boundaries. It is important that we secure the linguistic and cultural pluralism. So that the marginal-centric approach, as suggested by my colleague here in Delhi University, T. Satyanath, would open up new dimensions of world literature. And what we are saying that we need to reverse the approach to world literature from margin to center. That would be truly when not from the center to margin, but margin to center. In simple words, the possibility of studying the canons of world literature not in English, but rather in other languages, other Indian languages, to explore new areas of research, particularly those who are trying to explore this from the research point of view, from your MPhil and PhD, like you may do that, how we can, take up an alternative theoretical standpoint to explore into this. So what I'm trying to argue that world literature is not the clash between colonial and the colonized literature demanding the literary space. The former tries to prove its supremacy over the other, whereas the later attempts to claim its independent identity in the world forum. World literature may provide knowledge, but if it does not contribute to the idea of world peace and nourishment of human values, does not make it worthy of existence in the world forum, in the global forum, in the universal forum. We need to visualize that literature through a non-Eurocentric perspective, and not only in English, but in several languages to get the real essence of world literature. I'll kind of stop here, and like what I'm trying to argue that this is, this aspect, this is how it was. It used to be right from the beginning, and we need to check all hegemonic and kind of imperialistic tendencies in the field of language and literatures, and it will be a great when we are discussing it in our cultural context, the way we are, in a way, genetically, bilingual and monolingual, and our kind of our ability to relate to languages and narratives is visibly higher than everyone else. So this is important that we embrace this tradition and contribute to this, not in a passive way, but in an active way, through the act of translation and through all the agencies which are emerging. And I think time has come that now more and more we will make it more democratic with the inclusion of Indian or Eastern texts into this body, and we will I began with the attainment of world recognition. We'll see more and more texts there, and we'll see in the next 20 years more. Or you can say a truly democratic, truly universalistic sense of world literature. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. I'll be once again thanking all of you for your participation and your sense of audience for this interaction. I'll be glad to respond to any of the questions that we may have. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you, sir. Sir has given us a very comprehensive view of world literature, the finer nuances and aspects of world literature, how translation connects and binds people. And he has given us a food for thought also, how can Indian literature enter the world forum? So we feel quite enlightened, sir. Thank you once again. Now I take the honor of introducing our second resource person, Professor Manu Mangattu. Besides being a professor of English, Professor Manu is a poet, editor, lyricist, film critic, research consultant, and publishing expert. He has published 9 books, 79 international research publications, 97 academic papers, and 20 edited volumes with reputed publishers. He serves as chief editor for various international journals and is on the syllabus revision and approved committees of many reputed universities. He has done UGC-funded research projects and a Swayam MOOC course on romantic literature. He writes poetry in English and several Indian languages. A polyglot with a passion for music and film, he translates from Chinese, Persian, and Sanskrit. And the Chinese Poetry Conglomerate acknowledged his contributions in taking Chinese poetry to the Western world by naming him Comrade to Poetry China in 2016. A visiting faculty at various universities, he conducts poetry readings, workshops, and lectures. He won the prestigious Most Read and Recommended Researcher Award during the last 3 years, with close to 10,000 recommendations garnered throughout his career. After an apprenticeship in Shakespeare under Dr. Stephen Greenwald, Harvard University, Cambridge, he currently offers part-time guidance to 27 research scholars from India and abroad and mentors about 1,300 aspirants from NTA and NET examination. He also plies his trade in the film and publishing industry. We are very happy and delightful and proud to have you on board, sir, today, such a versatile personality that you are. Sir will deliberate on transcending boundaries and connecting cultures, introducing cultural studies. Welcome you and over to you, sir. Professor Manu Mangattu.
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning, one and all. So it's a pleasure
Good
to.
morning, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir. You're audible.
Okay. It's a great pleasure and a privilege for me to speak on this wonderful occasion. And well, I should first of all I should thank the organizers of this program, this wonderful institution for conducting this program. And something usually when we think of a principal of a college, we usually use adjectives like pillar of strength and dynamic. But I think when your principal was speaking, we really realized how dynamic and energetic and enthusiastic that person was. He was very energetic, very lively, and he gave a very invigorating short introduction to our theme. So it was very nice. And I would like to thank Kamal ma'am, the Honorable HOD of the department, Geeta ma'am, Subhash sir, the other colleagues from the Department of English for their invitation and for their very professional way of handling things. It was such a pleasure. It was such a privilege to be associated and connected with this institution and this wonderful department on this occasion of our webinar. So our webinar is titled World Literature, Transcending Boundaries and Connecting Cultures, and I would want to connect with that title first. My lecture is titled Transcending Boundaries and Connecting Cultures, an Introduction to Cultural Studies. So I have taken the tail of our title for the conference. Our conference is titled World Literature, Transcending Boundaries and Connecting Cultures, and my lecture is titled Transcending Boundaries and Connecting Cultures, Introducing or an Introduction to Cultural Studies. So I just want you to comprehend or think a little bit about the relationship. Where is world literature? Where is this connection and transcending boundaries? Where is literary theory and where comes cultural studies? Is there a connection? And this is a question that most research scholars have, and since much of our research and many of our research scholars are involved in a lot of studies involving cultural studies, the question as to the method of cultural studies, the methodologies employed by cultural studies are of great importance, and people are vastly confused as to how to go about this business of cultural studies. So what my lecture would be doing is I would begin with where Professor Dr. Parmod left off. I would start with world literature. I would take you through world literature to comparative literature, just very briefly in a couple of sentences, to comparative literature, and then from comparative literature to literary theory to cultural studies, and then the discussion will be about cultural studies. So I understand that many of you would be interested in knowing how or where or how can we connect these things. Yeah, we all know that there is some apparent connection between all these terms. We can see certain common terms connecting world literature and comparative literature and literary theory and then cultural studies, but where exactly can we connect? And this is just one view There are multiple views of connecting all this, multiple ways of connecting all this. So this is my humble attempt to connect and to expand on our knowledge of cultural studies, so that we can do cultural studies, we can do and perform cultural studies research in a better way, as we all are doing it with lot of vigor these days. So I will begin my lecture with a quotation, or I would go to the epitaph of T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot's epitaph, drawn from the lines from 4 quartets. It reads, "In my beginning is my end. In my end is my beginning." That's what my title was. In my beginning is my end. In my end is my beginning. I told you how I connected the title, the last part of the title, with the first part of my title. So, and what I am doing is I am beginning where Professor Dr. Parmod ended. And I shall be speaking about the beginning of the end. The beginning of the end. What is the beginning of the end? Dr. Parmod, he was telling us about world literature, the internationalist vision of Goethe, who spoke in 1827 about Welt literature, which can be translated as world literature. And then he also told us about Rabindranath Tagore, his concept of Vishwa Sahitya, world literature. Vishwa Sahitya that he expounded in 1907, and all this internationalist vision, literature as the common property of mankind, literature as something consecrated, and literature as the same, wherever it is studied, wherever it is discussed, literature as the common property, provision, common entity that binds mankind together. So that was what Dr. Parmod was telling us. Now I am taking you to the beginning of the end of the concept of world literature and comparative literature. I am not speaking about world literature or comparative literature, rather I would speak about the beginning of the end of world literature and comparative literature. And Dr. Parmod was he gave a very succinct statement at the beginning of his lecture, where he said world literature probably entered into a crisis in the 1950s, when people started looking at the national literatures, just what Goethe and Tagore were not speaking about, the importance given to nationalist literatures, something that people like Swapan Majumdar and the Indian comparatists are promoting. So the beginning of the end of this grand ideals propounded by world literature, literature as the common property of mankind, based on Goethe's idea, based on Tagore, and its offspring, comparative literature. I would call comparative literature an offspring of world literature. So this beginning of the end of world literature and comparative literature coincided with the advent of literary theory in the 1950s, and I would say in the 1960s. So what happened in the 1950s and 60s? In the 1950s, comparative literature hadn't yet taken off, though it had almost 125 years of history. It hadn't really taken off in the 1950s, when 125-year-old history and not yet taken off. It is a very bad beginning, right? 125 is too much for a beginning. So, but in the 1950s, suddenly students found comparative literature very alluring, very interesting. World literature very alluring and interesting. Why? Because of its transgressive nature. Because of the ability of comparative literature and world literature to transcend boundaries and connect cultures. Our title, Transcending Boundaries and Connecting Cultures. So this ability of comparative literature and world literature attracted students to comparative literature and world literature. However, that was a false hope. That was a false beginning. What happened? Students soon left world literature and comparative literature for courses in literary theory. And there we find that unfortunately for world literature and comparative literature, the advent of literary theory coincided with this particular phase in comparative literature, and so naturally what happened, naturally literary theory began to attract a lot of audience, and comparative literature started to lose ground. And what happened in literary theory? See, when you look at the beginning of literary theory, let's say theory began to influence literary studies in the 1950s, and it gained greater prominence and popularity since the 1960s. What happened in the 1960s? In the 1960s, Jacques Derrida, in 1966, 1967, Jacques Derrida came up with his wonderful thesis, wonderful paper at Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, USA, Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, which was a revolutionary and a landmark and a path-breaking event in all of literary and humanistic enterprise. So this essay marked a complete break from what was happening, and it started and it launched something very new. Literary theory was actually launched. Maybe we can say that literary theory was launched at this particular juncture. And this particular university, Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, USA, it played a key role in spreading the influence of literary theory from itself, from within to without, to the outside world. So universities like the Johns Hopkins University, Yale University, the Cornell University, these universities began spreading outwards the ideals of literary theory, and thus began literary theory in the academic sense. Now, literary theory too didn't have a great beginning. Yeah, it had a wonderful beginning with Derrida, we can say, but it had its baptism by fire. Its entry was marked by a war. What war? The theory wars. Its entry was marked by war. Theory wars. What happened? Because of the meteoric rise in popularity and the difficult language of its texts, the difficult names of its theorists, the difficulty of the titles of the texts that they wrote, the difficulty of the concepts that they propounded, what happened? Literary theory was often criticized as faddish, as a fad, fad, as a trend, as an obscurantist, trendy obscurantist movement. And there were heated debates on how theory should be fitted into literary study. So this was the question: how can we fit literary theory into literary studies? And these debates are sometimes referred to as the theory wars. Now, what was happening in the theory wars? Critics revolutionized departments of language and literature in colleges and universities across the UK, USA, across the West, where they worked. These people worked there, and there was lot of revolution, lot of debate, there was lot of argumentation. Careers were made and broken based upon extremely serious debates and hair-splitting argumentations based on three major concerns. One, canon formation. What books and authors were essential to the study of literature? Canon. What books and authors constitute the canon? First question. Then second question, what critical methods were acceptable and which critical methods were no longer consistent or politically tolerable? And thirdly and ultimately, who controlled the means to determine the answers to those questions? How do they decide? By publishing and rejecting scholarship in literary journals, in university presses. So who will decide what is to be published, what is to be written, what are the texts, and who are the authors that need to be given prominence? Who are the people who hire and fire in the big universities the trained literary scholars? So all these questions, I would sum up all these questions into one major idea. See, the theory was centered around this particular question. Which among the various strains of 20th century continental European thought should play a key role in the humanities? Which among these should play a key role? What should be given prominence in the academic studies in both teaching as well as research? Both teaching and research, what should be given prominence? Which among the strains, various types of literary concepts that emerged in 20th century European thought should be given prominence? And there were, as the theory was unfolded, there were three kinds of institutional responses to these theory wars, to this question of what is there, what is to be accepted and what is not to be accepted. So three kinds of institutional responses became clearly visible in the academia. First, theory was systematically introduced in courses and programs of literary disciplines. In universities, in the English departments, we had papers, we had subjects, we had semesters on literary theory. Systematically, literary theory was introduced in the academic programs, and all the apparatuses required for this became quickly available, especially as a plethora of theory textbooks, readers, introduction, short introduction, large introduction, middle introduction to literary theory. All these books became readily available in the market, and then what happened? Literary theory became a course for study in academic institutions. It became a part of the syllabus. Secondly, the second institutional response to the theory was the call for interdisciplinarity. Call for interdisciplinarity within the disciplinary space of literary studies. They said literary studies should not be like this anymore. After the theory wars, literary studies has to remold itself. It should have an interdisciplinary phase. What is this idea? See, this was variously and consistently contemplated and sometimes acted upon throughout the 1970s and the 1980s. And I would bring in a special scholar, a particular person, Jonathan Cullard. In his book, The Pursuit of Science, published in 1981, Jonathan Cullard recommended, as an institutional response to theory, Cullard recommended collaborative arrangements between literary studies departments and departments such as philosophy, psychology, linguistics, anthropology, history, sociology, for the benefit of literary students. For the benefit of literature students. This was the crux of Culler's argument. See, our literature students need to study a lot of things, and we know why he said that, right? Because when we are studying literary theory, we are studying everything except literature. We are studying a lot of anthropology, we are studying a lot of psychology, philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, but not literature. So Culler recommended that there should be arrangements where literature departments can collaborate with other departments in the same university, in the same college, for the benefit of our students. And towards the end of the 1980s, Gerald Gruff, another major writer who signified this paradigm shift, Gerald Gruff, he waxed eloquent on the promise of numerous programs that are being planned and integrated in different universities. And what do these programs do? He said these programs integrate literary theory and history in an interdisciplinary framework. Listen carefully. In an interdisciplinary framework, often under such rubrics as cultural studies or cultural history. So this was what Gruff said. He said interdisciplinarity in what sense? In the sense of cultural studies was being practiced in our academy. And the third institutional response to the theory was there were occasional attempts to take literary theory away from elitist institutional spaces of literary studies and find alternative spaces for cultural studies. Why? Because they found that cultural studies addresses a broader range of texts, including mass market texts and texts in other media. And so they suggested that we should separate literary studies from cultural studies. We should provide a new space for cultural studies. And this is how cultural studies entered the academic circles, entered the academia. In the course of the 1980s and the 1990s, numerous literary studies departments in the USA, in the UK, developed cultural studies sections within their fold. They had one English department, there was an English literature department, and there was a second part to the English department. Maybe a cubicle was given initially to cultural studies, then the cubicle expanded, and finally it swallowed the literature department. So this was what was happening. So to speak, cultural studies broke away from literary studies and constituted new programs in departments. Such a move was most lucidly and very convincingly conceptualized by Anthony Eastrop in his very famous book, written in 1991, titled Literary into Cultural Studies. Literary into Cultural Studies. See, look at the way he titles his book, Literary into Cultural Studies. Think of the implications. So, Eastrop in his book, he feels that theory had initiated a paradigm shift in literary studies which undermined, subverted the hegemonic ideology that is at the heart of literature itself. And so he recommended a separation of cultural studies within which the political direction of literary theory could be more meaningfully realized. The literary theory had its political aspirations. See, literary theory was not politically innocent or ignorant. It had its political aspirations, and Eastrop felt that only when we move literary theory away from cultural studies, or when we move out cultural studies from literature departments, can we actually realize the political possibilities, political dimension of theory in a more meaningful sense. And in this theory-informed breakaway, Eastrop called attention to texts of mass and popular culture, broadly understood, or what we usually call as cultural texts. Now, this is how cultural studies came to dominate the literary world, the academy, the literary, I'm speaking only about the academic field, how it dominated our syllabi and how it dominated our texts, our courses. So what is this relationship between literary studies and cultural studies? Is there a relationship? Literary studies, cultural studies. What is the relationship? See, cultural studies. Now, what is the relation? I would give you a perspective. Cultural studies has simultaneously been three things. One, it has been a popular sub-discipline within literary disciplines. So, as a subcategory of as a subcategory of literary studies, cultural studies has existed. Occasionally, cultural studies has existed as a separate humanistic discipline alongside literary studies, and sometimes literary studies became a subcategory of cultural studies. So all these things happened, and we do not actually know, or we are not yet sure which is the umbrella term and which is the subterm. Is it literary theory as the umbrella term, or is it cultural studies as the umbrella term, or do they just coexist? That is the that is the way we can understand this relationship, and it should not be my argument. So this is what Jonathan Culler says in his very short short and beautiful book, an introduction to, a short introduction, a very short introduction to literary theory. So in that book, Jonathan Culler says that in principle, cultural studies includes and encompasses literary studies, examining literature as a particular cultural practice. Literature itself becomes a subcategory of cultural studies. Literature becomes one of the cultural practices that cultural studies is analyzing. However, it is not as simple as that. In theory, cultural studies is all encompassing, no question about that, because at the same time we study William Shakespeare and who is it, and rap culture, rap music. At the same time we study high culture and low culture. At the same time we study cultures of the past and the cultures of the present. But in practice, since meaning is based on difference, I hope our audience is good enough to appreciate that. Meaning is based on difference. I am speaking about the structuralist view. Meaning, what Saussure and others said, meaning is based on difference. So if meaning is based on difference, people do cultural studies as opposed to something else. There should be some opposition in which cultural studies must operate. And as opposed to what? Since cultural studies arose out of literary studies, the answer often is cultural studies is practiced as opposed to literary studies, traditional literary studies, not modern literary studies, traditional literary studies. And here opposition doesn't mean any kind of ideological opposition. I am speaking about a binary opposition where one is understood, or one is, one gets more, we speak about contrast. The best way to understand something is by contrast. So we contrast. To understand cultural studies best, we can contrast it with literary studies in the traditional sense. And what is literary studies in the traditional sense? The liberal humanist way of understanding literature, where the task, traditionally the task was the interpretation of the literary work as the achievement of the author. So the author is the producer of the meaning. Author was not dead in traditional literature. The text was, the author was not dead. The work was there. That was not replaced by the text. We didn't start speaking about discourses. So there was a permanent meaning in a text, and this meaning can be discovered by the critic, by the reader if he is very good. So the reader, the author, all these people had great prominence. The task of interpretation of literature based on the achievements of the authors, the main justification of studying literature being the value associated with great canonical works, their complexity, their beauty. These are traditional ways of understanding literature: beauty, insights, universality, the benefit to the reader, affective studies, the effect that literature has on the reader. So on these lines, literature along these lines, it is as opposed to literature along these lines that cultural studies was studied or is studied. So there is an opposition, and it is in this opposition that cultural studies gains its meaning and prominence. And hence, in principle, there need not be any conflict between literary studies and cultural studies, because cultural studies arose out of the application of techniques of literary analysis to other cultural materials, and it treats, cultural studies treats cultural artifacts as texts to be read rather than as objects that are simply to be counted. So what I am saying is there need not be any opposition between literary studies and cultural studies, at least in principle. And what is the advantage to literary studies? Conversely, we can say literary studies gains when literature is studied as a particular cultural practice and works are related to other discourses. So literature also gains from cultural studies gains from literature. So what is the problem? In principle, both complement each other, both help each other, and they are like a made for each other couple. They complement each other very well. However, problems arise later, right? And a storm was brewing, as is the case with every made for each other couple. A storm was brewing. A storm was brewing, the problem of the canon. So Christopher Ricks in 1981 said something. He said, I'm reading, obviously, no one objects to the presence of structuralists and theorists of film and linguistics in the English faculty. No, we don't have any problem if structuralists and film theorists are in our department. We don't have any problem with them. We don't have any social distancing. We don't have any allergy for structuralists and film theorists. They can sit there. But there is a question of proportion. This is what Christopher Ricks says. There's a question of proportion, right? That there should be some manners. There should be some basic manners. It is our job to teach and uphold the canon of English literature. So we have a consecrated canon. We have made a canon and we are very proud of it and we will care for it. We are very much concerned about our canon. So don't see, dear cultural theorists, don't dare to enter into our area. This is our field. Don't enter the lion's den to fight it. So this was what Christopher Ricks said, and there was this real doubt among anxiety between among literary theorists, literary thinkers, that what will become of the literary canon if cultural studies swallows literary studies. So this was very likely to happen. What if cultural studies swallows literary studies? We won't have any literary studies. And what is the real problem? If there is no literary studies and if I am a literature teacher, then I will lose my job. As simple as that, as existential a problem as that. So I cannot allow cultural studies to swallow my discipline. I will hold fort. I will hold my discipline in great esteem. So the question was also, have the soap operas replaced Shakespeare? And if so, is cultural studies to blame? Won't cultural studies kill literature by encouraging the study of such myriad things as films, television, popular cultural forms, rather than the study of classics of world literature that we were so interested in? So will cultural studies kill literary studies? So this was a major anxiety among people. But a similar thing happened with literary theory as well. When literary theory was gaining prominence, people were worried, and there was a charge made against theory that it encouraged the reading of philosophical, it will take students away from classics, away from canonical literary works. Why? Because literary theory encouraged, it promoted a reading of philosophical and psychoanalytical texts alongside literary works. So literary classics may gradually go into the margins. This was one fear with literary theory as well. So literary studies has this fear when literary theory came about, that it will erode their area, it will take the space occupied by our canonical texts. But what happened with literary theory? Theory invigorated the traditional literary canon, opening the door to more ways of reading than the great works of more ways of reading the canonical works. It helped, literary theory helped read the great works of English and British and American literature, and this way, in a sense, what we see is, in a sense, literary theory opened the doors for literary studies. So this was what happened. So what I am saying is, the fear of literature scholars that literary studies would undermine and take the space of cultural. Is there an issue? Hello?
Please continue, sir.
Hello, am I disconnected?
We can hear you, Mr. Manu. We can hear you.
Okay.
You're audible. Yeah,
Am I
you're
visible?
audible.
Am I visible?
Yeah, sure. We can
Okay.
see you and we can hear you.
Okay. So the problem with the canon, that was what I was talking about. So literary study. So what happened was literary theory in fact opened the doors for the canonical works of literature. So thanks to literature, so much started to be written about Shakespeare than literature itself couldn't do. He studied, William Shakespeare started to be studied from every conceivable angle. I can see a blank screen suddenly. What is happening? Do you see a blank screen?
Professor Manu, now we are not able to see you. Neither we can hear your voice.
I can. I think I am not mute.
Yeah. Now we can see you. You are audible now.
Should I rejoin? There is a lot of darkness. That is what I see.
Professor Manu, we can hear you. You are audible. I think there is some technical glitch on his side.
मैं एक बार फोन कर सकते हैं क्या उन्हें?
हाँ जी, फोन करती हूँ.
Hello, madam. Yeah, I'm connected, ma'am. What has happened is I cannot unmute because it says the meeting doesn't allow people to unmute themselves. So please allow me to unmute, and then I should, yeah.
Sir, please unmute yourself.
Yeah. Am I? Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. You are audible.
Okay. Thank you. So where did we stop? Okay, I was speaking about literary theory and how literary theory came into. I lost touch. Came into literary studies. So yeah, I was saying that literary theory, what happened was there was this fear that literary theory would erode the space of literary studies, but instead what happened was the great canonical works of literature were highlighted in fact by literary theory. I was speaking of the example of William Shakespeare, or when you look at William Wordsworth, for example. See what happened with Wordsworth. Wordsworth again gained a lot more prominence because of or thanks to literary theory. So he has been transformed by literary theory from a poet of nature, from a mere poet of nature, to a key figure of modernity. So who has missed or what has suffered neglect are not the great canonical works in literary. When literary theory came into into literary studies, what's really suffered were the minor works that were regularly studied when literary study was organized to cover historical periods and genres. For example, if we are studying Elizabethan literature, as a paper in English literature, we will be studying William Shakespeare definitely, but we will also be studying people like Beaumont and Fletcher and Christopher Marlowe, Dekker, Haywood, Ben Jonson. But what happened with literary theory was Shakespeare was more highlighted than he was usually in literary history. But literary theory, with the coming on of literary theory, what happened was these inferior writers or the lesser known among the Elizabethan writers went out of notice. So this is what happened. So the minor writers went out of the picture. So this is one thing that happened. We feared that canonical authors will be pushed out, but that didn't happen. What happened was minor authors were and minor things were pushed out, which otherwise wouldn't have happened had we been studying the traditional way of studying literature as literary history. So then there is this question: would cultural studies have a similar effect, providing new contexts and increasing the range of issues for a few literary works, few very popular canonical literary works, while taking students away from others? So far, the growth of cultural studies has only accompanied an expansion of the literary canon, and this is something that cultural studies has done to literature. Instead of just saying that, instead of just marginalizing canonical works, or instead of removing certain minor authors from literary studies, what cultural studies has done is it has resulted, in a way, it has resulted in an expansion of the literary canon. Literary canon has become more inclusive, transcending boundaries, bridging cultures. This is something that cultural studies has done. So what about the relationship between theory and cultural studies? Hitherto I was talking about the relationship between literary studies and cultural studies. So what about the relationship between literary theory and cultural studies? Of course, historically I explained that, but what is the relationship? Again, I will take you to Jonathan Culler, and Jonathan Culler says if theory is the theory of literature, then cultural studies is the practice. Cultural studies is the way of doing literary theory. This is the relationship. So he says if you had to say what theory is the theory of, the answer would be something like signifying practices, the production and representation of experience, constitution of human subjects, in short something like culture in the very broad sense. And one can even say the two go together. Literary theory and cultural studies go together. Theory is the theory and cultural studies is the practice. In other words, cultural studies is the practice of which what we call theory for short is the theory. This is explicitly what Jonathan Culler says, and I would love to share his own opinion. Share in the sense I want to agree to what he said and felt about cultural studies. And now finally, what is the method of cultural studies, or how can we do cultural studies? What is the method of cultural studies? See, there is a criticism that cultural studies is without tangible methods. It doesn't have a proper methodology. How do we do cultural studies? It doesn't have a proper methodology. This is a problem that most students, most research scholars face, and they ask us that how? What is the methodology that I should adopt? So this is a frustrating question for researchers, because anybody who is working in cultural studies will have encountered this problem. what is the methodology? How should we go about doing cultural studies? Historically, the question of cultural studies methodologies has been obscured by an assumption that any book on research, we have a lot of books on research methodology, research methodologies, quantitative research, qualitative research. People think, or people suggest, even research supervisors suggest research scholars that you take those books and study, and that is how we do cultural studies. So any book on literary, any book on research will do for cultural studies. So any book on qualitative data, thesis writing, social research and the like would variously satisfy the needs of a field which fundamentally requires methodological eclecticism. Yeah, that much we agree. It is very eclectic in nature. It draws from various disciplines, and so supervisors generally suggest to the scholars doing research in cultural studies to take any book on research and study, and that is how you can do cultural studies. However, that is not a satisfying answer, right? We need something better. What is the method of doing cultural studies? How can we do cultural studies research? So here I would, due to time constraints and this lecture doesn't go into those things, but I will suggest two very useful books for people who are doing research in cultural studies, and that is, one is Paula Sokko, Saukko. She has written an amazing book titled Doing Research in Cultural Studies, and another book. These two books came in the early 21st century, but these are still the best books available as far as doing cultural studies is concerned. First book, Paula Saukko's Doing Research in Cultural Studies, Doing Research in Cultural Studies, Paula Saukko, Saukko. And the second person is Anne Gray, Anne Gray. Gray. She has written a wonderful book titled Research Practice for Cultural Studies. These two books, there are so many books out there, but many of them fail to address the key issues. So these two books would be very good as far as this question is concerned. So what is the dilemma? What is the dilemma in cultural studies, or what is the problem with methodology in cultural studies? So researchers in cultural studies always confront two major questions. One, how one can do justice to the lived experience of people, because cultural studies is about culture, lived experience of people. So how can we do justice to that lived experience of people while at the same time critically analyze discourses which form the very stuff out of which experiences are made? Our experiences are made out of discourses. So how can we critically analyze discourses while at the same time analyzing and doing justice to the lived experience of people? First concern. I am sure anybody who is doing cultural studies research will understand what I am saying. And the second major concern, major dilemma is, how can one criticize discourses which constitute reality while at the same time make statements about historical and political reality? Because cultural studies is also about economics, also about historical reality, also about political reality. So how will you do all these things simultaneously? This is another major dilemma. And to understand the problem better, what is this problem? To understand it, we need to take a flashback. We need to go a little back to the beginnings of cultural studies. See, where did cultural studies begin? Cultural studies emerged from the political and intellectual climate and situation of Great Britain in the 1960s and 1970s. This is what we study everywhere. In the 1960s and 70s, Britain, and we study about the founding of the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies by Richard Hogarth in 1964, and it became the world's first institutional home for cultural studies. And Hogarth also did something else. He appointed Stuart Hall as his apprentice, as his assistant, and effectively from 1968 onwards he became the all in all of CCCS, and in 1971 he officially became the chairman of Center for Cultural Studies. So Stuart Hall says something. He says this was a time, about that particular period, this was a time when the field of research was structured by hard-nosed positivist empirical inquiry, often of a functionalist ilk, and traditional Marxist political economy. Oh, what is that? It is very tough, right? I will just explain. It's very simple. What he is saying is, he is basically speaking about the polarity between right-wing optimism and left-wing pessimism. On the one hand, there is the optimism of the right-wing advocates of literary and cultural theory, and on the other hand, there was the pessimism of the left-wing theories. So this was the polarity that Stuart Hall was speaking about, and in this polarized situation, cultural studies carved a niche, carved itself a space between and beyond these two polarized positions. So what did it do? To do this, it welded together humanistic, three things. It welded together humanistic, structuralist, and new left Marxist philosophies. Three things: humanistic philosophy, structuralist philosophy, and new left Marxist philosophy. So what is the humanistic philosophy that cultural studies adopted? The humanist bent in cultural studies aimed to understand and capture the creative potential of people's lived lives, such as, for example, it looked at working class culture and the potential of working class culture. So the humanistic side of cultural studies. Secondly, the structuralist side of cultural studies. What was it? The structuralist methods, such as semiotics, for example, focused attention on linguistic patterns. So we are into text, linguistic patterns and tropes that recur, that repeat in literary texts and in texts such as popular culture, and that shape our thinking. This is the linguistic side, second side. And the third one, the new left Marxist philosophy. What is that? New leftism brought an interest in examining the relationship between the lived experiences of the people and the body of text. So the first two. New left Marxism brought together an amalgamation of the first two, the humanistic and the structuralist philosophy, and thus they could do a larger social, political, and environmental, economic environment in which cultural studies could operate. And these three philosophical currents enabled cultural studies to articulate a mediating space between right-wing optimism and left-wing pessimism. So a middle path between left-wing pessimism, right-wing of optimism. What was this pessimism all about? Pessimism was the left-wing of pessimism was about democracy. Democracy failed. Right-wing optimism was about democracy. Democracy succeeded. Left-wing of pessimism said democracy descended to fascism. Right-wing optimism said democracy was successful. Even communist regimes were getting devastated. So democracy succeeded. So there was this, the political scenario of the time, and it explains all these things. So these and three fundamental questions have been particularly pertinent in research methodology. First question: has our interest in cultures that are radically different from our own culture? For example, working class culture, or for a Westerner, non-Western culture, for an Easterner, non-Eastern culture. Is this warranted, and can we understand and do justice to cultures which are not our own? First question: can we do justice to cultures which we do not belong to? The second question: how can we critically analyze culture in a situation where we ourselves as scholars and research as an institution are an integral part of culture and these struggles? So we are situated in culture, and so how can we criticize the same culture that we are a part of? This was another question that people faced. And the third question, it takes a slightly different tasks and asks, and it is very pertinent: is culture, cultural studies ask this question, Is culture the most important topic to investigate? Should we be investigating cultural studies now? Is culture the most important topic to investigate in the face of grueling global economic inequality and exploitation? Or in other words, let's say in our present situation, in the face of corona, should we be investigating medicines for corona, or should we be investigating culture? Is culture more important than all this, or is culture over and above all this? So this was a problem. And why this problem happened is, again, there is a problem with the way we understand research. Generally, researchers understand research methodology or research method in positivist terms, as if it is a magnifying lens that you insert between the scholars. So I am a scholar, I am reading a text, and there is a lens. So this lens is what helps me read this text. And what is this lens doing? It magnifies this text for me so that I can read this text better. I can understand this text closer. So that is the way research methodology is generally understood, as a lens with which we can understand our text better. So it is understood that if we use these methods or lenses correctly, or according to as per instructions, as per conditions, then they will help. These lenses called research methodology will help us as researchers to get closer to an accurate or objective and unbiased view of reality. So there is a reality out there, and we can approximate, we can come closer to that reality by using this lens called research methodology. And it is important for, but is it always the case? Yeah, we say that use research methodology as a lens, but is there one reality that you are looking at, or does the reality change according to the lens that you use? So this is the change in perspective that we want. Ramapriya, you are looking so cute, and you are having your tongue out, very beautiful. I can see a video. That was nice. So what cultural studies researcher need to do is to change his perspective. We need to acknowledge that reality changes when we change the research approach or lens through which we look at it. And I do not subscribe to the idea that we should find out one truth about reality or about one reality, but I won't recommend either the relativist idea that different methodological approaches open up multiple incommensurable realities. No, that will lead to a lot of chaos. So on the contrary, ideally, what a cultural studies researcher needs to do is to foment conversations or dialogues between different research methodologies and approaches in the world, in order to cultivate a type of cultural studies sensitive to the complexity, multidimensionality of the contemporary global social personal reality. And this is something that in her work, Paula Sacco, Sacco does this. She says that we can use the notion of scapes by Arjun Appadurai as a framework to study cultural studies. Arjun Appadurai's idea of scapes, flows, all these ideas can be used as a framework, as a model research methodology for the cultural studies researcher. Now, who is Arjun Appadurai? He is a major theorist in globalization studies. Arjun Appadurai is a major theorist in globalization studies. And what is globalization? Globalization is the closer integration. I am not going into any definitions. It is the closer integration of everything and everything. What does it do ultimately is to connect, transcend boundaries and connect cultures. And this is where I would take you to, and as I am winding up my lecture, this is where I would take you to globalization. One word that Professor Dr. Parmod was using repeatedly, globalization. What does globalization do? Again, globalization, which is the watchword or the millennial catchphrase for the 21st century. It is the watchword, definitely the catchword for cultural studies. So what does globalization do? closer integration, closer interaction between people, companies, governments worldwide, resulting in better exchange of ideas, beliefs, and culture. Globalization is primarily an economic process of interaction and integration that is associated with social and cultural aspects. Now let us look at the title of our conference once again, especially the second part. Our title is World Literature, Transcending Boundaries and Connecting Cultures. Now let me ask you, from these discussions of globalization, from these discussions, look at the text that Appadurai wrote. I don't go to those things. Look at the titles of the text that Appadurai wrote. Most of the text has either globalization or culture in one part of the title and either of them in the other part of the title. So globalization and cultural studies are closely linked. And when we look at the second, when you look at the second part of our topic, transcending boundaries and connecting cultures, it is all about cultural studies and globalization as well. So in this scenario of blurring boundaries, what I would suggest, or what cultural studies would suggest, is a dialogue, is a closer integration between different methodologies, different ways of analyzing, understanding literary texts, cultural texts, so that we can have a more open, more pluralistic society, a more pluralistic way of understanding our world, a more inclusive and open-ended life. Thank you. So that brings to an end my short lecture, and I thank all the participants for their listening, and we shall have questions. If anybody has any questions, we shall definitely take those questions.
Yeah, if any participant has any query or question, he or she can put it in the chat box. In the meanwhile, thank you so much, Manu sir, for your insightful lecture and the beautiful way you linked world literature with cultural studies. You also very beautifully talked about the relationship between cultural studies and literary theories and their relationship. We thoroughly enjoyed the lecture and learned a lot. Hope to have such professional academic associations with you in near future. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.
And I'm waiting for the questions if there are any.
Yeah, Krati Pomya has asked, can you provide the list of the books? Definitely. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a PPT. I know. What I will do is I will share the list of books and the references that I gave. I will share it with the organizers, and I hope the organizers have a way of communicating with the participants, right? You have some WhatsApp.
Sir.
Yeah, so yeah, that will be fine. So I will share the a PDF, not a PPT, a PDF of what the books I referred, and maybe I shall try to give a summary of what I spoke as well. So okay, so I will give the list of the books, all the books, references, the quotations, all this I will give to the organizers, and they will share it with you in the groups.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And I think we have shared the feedback link also in the chat box. If not, the technical support can do that. The feedback link for the participants for e-certificates. Now I invite Dr. Geeta Gupta to propose a vote of thanks to our learned resource persons and participants. Over to Dr. Geeta Gupta.
Thank you, Sarika. Internet has truly transcended boundaries so that we got the opportunity to listen such amazing presentations. I take it as a privilege to extend a vote of thanks. On behalf of Department of English, I, Geeta Gupta, extend a heartfelt gratitude for our principal, sir, Dr. Krishna Khan Gupta. It is his vision which keeps us motivating to do something significant in our lives. I am grateful to our resource persons, Professor Parmod Mehra and Professor Manu Mangattu, for the time and efforts they took to share their knowledge and experiences with us. Please accept our sincere thanks for the outstanding presentation. Sir, we are looking forward to future collaboration also. I would like to thank my colleagues and participants from different colleges across nation, without whom this event can't be imagined. I would like to thank the convener of this webinar, Madam Kamal Tandon, co-convener Dr. Sarika, coordinators Dr. Inayat and Mr. Subhash for their valuable contribution. Last but not the least, I would like to thank Mr. Vineet Nagpal for technical support and smooth functioning of the event. Thank you all. Now I request all the participants, please turn on their videos so that we can have group photograph. Please turn on your video.
Vineet?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Just a minute, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vineet.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Manu sir. Thank you, Dr.
Dr. Manu, please fill the feedback form.
We can post it into the groups also.
Yeah.
Because we have time constraint now.
Because we have a webinar.
Yes, ma'am.
That is about to start within 5 or 10 minutes. So we are sorry, Professor Manu, we had to interrupt you. We were enjoying your talk a lot. So in future, we will look forward to your insights on various topics.
I will take that with a pinch of salt. When it is literary theory and cultural studies, I know you cannot enjoy.
It's always a peace to listen you.
But you did full justice to the topic, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
May I end the meeting now?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.